Reasons to be cheerful. 1, 2, 3.
We do like to feature guests who are not international film stars.
Of all the men, I'm the best. Whereas you're just a groom.
Not especially glamorous, whose names are not guaranteed box office all around the world.
I haven't seen enough women naked. I haven't touched enough women.
I'm just in big need of showing my body.
Tune in Thursday from 9:30 on BBC One.
Reasons to be cheerful. 1, 2, 3.
This is BBC One. Now we join the brand new channel for reports and events from around the world, every night, every week. BBC News 24.
And we welcome our viewers on BBC One. It's 1:56, the headlines. Louise Woodward has walked free from a Massachusetts court after her conviction for the murder of an 8-month-old baby was changed to involuntary manslaughter. The Prime Minister Tony Blair has promised that Britain will play a leading role in Europe. And at the United Nations Security Council, they're still trying a diplomatic solution to the crisis over Iraq's refusal to allow UN inspectors access to weapons sites. You're watching BBC News 24.
75 years at the heart of the nation, broadcasting to the world. The BBC. As preparation for the age of digital television, the 24-hour news channel you're watching is available through the night on BBC One, providing in-depth news, a broader range of stories, the best of public service broadcasting.
A news channel for the 21st century.
Reflecting the whole of the UK.
Covering the issues that directly affect our audience.
Reporting round the clock.
The whole picture, the whole of the time.
This is BBC News 24 on BBC One.
Wherever the news is happening, we'll be in the right place.
At the right time.
With around 250 correspondents in key locations.
The largest news gathering operation in the world is going to find the perfect outlet on our 24-hour channel. After all, you never know when news is going to break.
We're deeply concerned by today's news.
From all the regions, coast to coast, city to city, no one has the UK covered like the BBC.
Our new state-of-the-art newsroom is linked directly to the BBC's news gathering network through the most up-to-date digital technology.
Making the most of the BBC's resources.
Understanding news demands experience.
The biggest names in TV journalism offer their perspective on events.
From entertainers to politicians, the world's movers and shakers, revealed and revealing one-to-one.
From world events to business, sport, entertainment and weather.
What do you think of that?
We're committed to putting the news in context, providing news when you want it.
At News 24, you will never be more than a few minutes away from the day's top stories. BBC News 24, we're there for you.
If you want the whole picture the whole time, stay tuned to BBC News 24. Available through the night on BBC One.
Hello, you're watching BBC News 24. I'm Maxine Mawhinney. The headlines at 2 o'clock. Louise Woodward is freed as murder is reduced to manslaughter. Campaigners go wild as judge says her sentence is served. And Blair pledges Britain will be a guiding light in Europe. The British au pair Louise Woodward has walked free from a Massachusetts court after a judge changed her conviction for the murder of an 8-month-old baby to involuntary manslaughter. He sentenced her to 279 days in prison, the exact amount of time she's already spent behind bars. But she can't return to England yet. The prosecution is appealing against the judge's ruling, and Louise's lawyers will also contest the manslaughter verdict.
Louise Woodward was brought to the courthouse from her prison cell and taken in through a back entrance to avoid the scores of cameras outside. Inside, looking nervous, she took her place beside her defence counsel. Judge Hilla Zobel said it was not a time to argue about whether Louise was guilty or not, as both sets of lawyers made a brief submission.
Despite the jury's verdict and this court's finding of the defendant's guilt, the defendant refuses to accept responsibility for killing Matthew Eapen. The defendant has not acknowledged doing anything to Matthew Eapen which would equate with manslaughter. And the defendant has never shown any remorse for the killing of Matthew Eapen.
As her parents watched, Louise maintained what she said during her trial.
That I'm innocent.
A few minutes later came the judge's ruling.
It is in my judgment time to bring the judicial part of this extraordinary matter to a compassionate conclusion. Taking all the circumstances into account, I regard a proper sentence to be 279 days in the House of Correction, same deemed served.
Although Louise doesn't have to go back to jail, she can't leave the state of Massachusetts until the prosecution appeal. The judge was criticised strongly outside the court by a clearly bitter prosecution.
This morning, almost no notice. Everything turned upside down. The judge took that jury's verdict away.
But Louise's own lawyers are already preparing their appeal.
We still believe that the scientific investigation of this case is not over, and there is yet even more evidence that we can bring to bear on this case that may satisfactorily resolve it for all concerned. So it's not over in that regard.
So the fight to clear Louise Woodward's name completely goes on. Andy Ty, BBC News.
Well, the news was received with jubilation at the Louise Woodward campaign headquarters in Elton, the village where in Cheshire, where the au pair came from. The campaign is based in the Rigger pub, where locals have steadfastly believed in Louise Woodward's innocence. And Louise's sister Vicky has told reporters about a telephone conversation she had with her after the judge's ruling.
And I couldn't believe it. My dad said, do you want to speak to someone? And he put my sister on and I screamed. I couldn't believe it. I screamed. And she sounded so happy. She just sounded so happy.
And was she ready to move to walk free or not? Had she prepared for it?
No, she hadn't prepared for it at all. She was expecting 10 years. She said, I thought they were going to give me 10 years, so I haven't packed my stuff. All my stuff's still at prison. She hasn't packed any of it.
Did she say anything about how quickly she wants to come home? Or did anybody there say that?
They just want to come home as soon as they can. As soon as they can.
Do you now feel in yourself this is an end to it? Clearly people here don't. They think you should go on.
It won't be an end to it until we've cleared a name. We're going to fight until we've cleared a name because she's innocent. She didn't do anything. But this will do for now. Just bring her home. This will do.
The Home Secretary has announced there will be a review of the sentences imposed on the two boys convicted of murdering the toddler James Bolger. But Jack Straw said the sentences would not be reviewed until the boys had served at least half of their prison sentences. He said he would be setting new periods of imprisonment known as tariffs for Robert Thompson and John Venables, after a House of Lords ruling said that his predecessor Michael Howard had been wrong to increase them to 15 years. Tony Blair has pledged to make Britain a guiding light in Europe, with influence, not impotence, in shaping the single currency. He said in a speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet in London that one of his main foreign policy principles is to end Britain's isolation of the last 20 years. Later today, he's expected to reinforce the message that he wants monetary union to be a success and for Britain to be part of it.
In the white tie and tails Chancellor Gordon Brown had refused to wear for his city debut, Mr Blair kept to another tradition, addressing the Lord Mayor's banquet on foreign affairs.
Britain is part of Europe. It must play its full part in leading it. Not for the weak reason that there is no alternative. Of course there's an alternative. We could go. But in fact it is in the British national interest to stay. So I say, if we are staying, let us for heaven's sake do so with effect and impact and influence. We are the bridge in many ways between the US and Europe. Well, let us use it. When Britain and America work together on the international scene, there is little we cannot achieve.
On Iraq, there was a strong warning that Saddam Hussein should not interpret as weakness the international community's desire to find a peaceful way forward if possible.
It is vital for all of us that the UN inspectors are allowed to complete their work with no suggestion of discrimination against our US allies. Only then can the question of relaxing sanctions arise.
The government's determination to stand firm against a still dangerous dictator is unshakable, he said. A clear hint of support for any American military action.
The Labour Party is handing back a donation from the Formula One racing chief, Bernie Ecclestone. The move follows advice from the chairman of the committee set up to combat so-called sleaze. Last weekend, the government announced that Formula One would be exempt from a ban on tobacco sponsorship. Our political correspondent John Pienaar reports.
Tony Blair, here hosting a reception at Downing Street last month, agreed to shelve the ban on tobacco sponsorship in Formula One racing after Bernie Ecclestone told him racing could be driven abroad and thousands of jobs lost. That was seen as a victory for Formula One and an embarrassing U-turn by the government. Tonight, Mr. Ecclestone has joined Labour in denying the more embarrassing suggestion that he bought influence with political donations. He said in a statement, "I met Mr. Blair in July 1996 and was very impressed with him and his plans for our country. I have never sought any favour from New Labour or any member of the government, nor has any been given." Labour consulted Sir Patrick Neil, who's taken over Lord Nolan's Committee on Standards in Public Life, about how to handle the donation last week. His advice: silence the critics and give the money back.
People will draw adverse conclusions, whether justly or unjustly, doesn't matter. They will, in a cynical way, suspect the worst. So get rid of the money, return it.
Labour says it's ending the secrecy of party funding. It'll name those benefactors who give more than £5,000 at its annual conference. Other parties will have to follow suit. The Tories want to keep Labour under pressure.
I think we just need to know what all the facts are. Who made the decision, why was it made, and was there any relationship between the people who went to see the Prime Minister and giving money to the Labour Party?
The government is hoping it's disarmed its critics.
By acting swiftly, by handing the money back, by confirming that we're having this full inquiry into party political funding, we've been able to draw a line under this particular event.
Tonight, ministers hope they've silenced the suggestion that influence can be bought and sold. But the accusation that Labour gave in to pressure still hangs in the air. And this affair has brought a little closer the end of Labour's charmed existence since the election in May. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
A former doctor at Ashworth High Security Psychiatric Hospital on Merseyside says the women's wards are unsafe and that women are frequently maltreated. The hospital contains some of Britain's most violent criminals and sex offenders. Last week, Helen Liebling won a year-long battle against the hospital for sexual discrimination. She's spoken for the first time about her experiences to Claire Smith.
Helen Liebling fought for 18 months to be allowed to talk about what she saw at Ashworth. Now the hospital settled her case for constructive dismissal without asking her to sign a gagging clause.
I witnessed one woman being restrained. She was very distressed and running through the ward. She was restrained by 5 men who jumped on top of her in a manner in which she was not able to breathe properly.
Ms Liebling has wrung one concession from Ashworth. The new chief executive will meet her to discuss women's services.
The Education Secretary David Blunkett has defended the government's controversial policy of naming and shaming schools that are failing. He said that of the 18 schools identified, most have made real improvements, and he was ready to do the same thing again.
Last May, this Liverpool school was one of the 18 named and shamed as one of the worst schools in England. 6 months on, it has a new head teacher and is making reasonable progress. The government says this shows that highlighting failure works. The new head disagrees.
I know it had a demoralising effect on the teachers. The youngsters themselves were bemused. Why suddenly was their school one of the worst in the country? And we also know that a number of parents actually pulled their youngsters out of the school prior to starting in September as a direct result of the naming. So in that sense, no, it was not a good policy.
Abbey Farm Middle School in Norfolk has progressed enough to come off the failure list altogether. Indeed, most of the 18 schools have improved, and some say they were improving before the government acted. But ministers say the public spotlight made them move faster. Angry teacher unions still insist it's a political stunt, stinging ministers into this response.
The action has worked, the action has improved those schools, the children now have a chance of their education improving and their life chances flourishing. I make no apology for it and will continue doing it, whatever anybody says.
This South London primary is one of a few schools ministers are still unhappy with. It gets a new head in January. Elsewhere, one school will be shut and then reopened under a new name to give it a fresh start. Ministers say they'll be watching these schools. Whether being named helped or hindered these schools will be bitterly debated. But the government believes it has succeeded in bringing out into the open problems which in the past were often hidden from parents. Mike Baker, BBC News, at the Department for Education.
And you're watching BBC News 24. The headlines. A judge has freed Louise Woodward after reducing her conviction for the murder of an 8-month-old baby to manslaughter. The prosecution is to appeal. Tony Blair has promised that Britain will be a leading force in the future of Europe. And the United Nations Security Council is trying to find an answer to the escalating crisis over Iraq's refusal to allow UN inspectors access to weapon sites. And now for more on that story and the rest of the international news, let's go over to Taimur Nabili. Taimur.
Maxine, thanks very much. As you said, members of the United Nations Security Council are meeting to decide on possible further action against Iraq over its continuing refusal to allow Americans to participate in the UN weapons inspections. The United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan has said that Baghdad is still refusing to back down in the confrontation with the US, despite talks in New York with the Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister. Earlier, Iraq threatened to shoot down any American aircraft found in its airspace.
Extracting the maximum publicity potential, presenting Iraq as a victim, Saddam Hussein invited hundreds of people to come and stay in the presidential palace. Many brought young children. The atmosphere was festive, but the exercise had a deadly purpose. These people are human shields, bedding down in buildings which the government believe could be targets. The weapons ranged against Iraq are mostly offshore in the Gulf, on a formidable American task force headed by the USS Nimitz. As well as these warplanes, the fleet carries cruise missiles, which can map-read their way to specific targets. With this force, America could go it alone, but they want wider support to justify any military action. 12 British Tornadoes are on standby in Saudi Arabia and Turkey. America could also fly operations from bases in Britain.
We will be robust in making sure that the world community's view is delivered to Saddam Hussein in the toughest and most robust way that is possible.
UN weapons inspectors were close to uncovering a hoard of deadly VX nerve gas when this crisis began, and they believe Iraq has destroyed only 2/3 of its biological weapons stocks, leaving 6 tons of agents, including anthrax, unaccounted for.
It possesses the means to make precisely those weapons. It has made them in the past. It's refusing to tell us whether or not it's still making them. If it were able to deliver them any distance, it should frighten the people who live in whatever distance that is, near, middle or far.
On a last-ditch attempt to stop punitive bombing raids, Iraq's Deputy Prime Minister arrived in New York knowing that this time the Security Council is united. Iraq has been condemned even by France and Russia, countries which have wavered before. The UN Secretary-General says he offered the Iraqis a ladder to climb down, but they've not taken it.
He did not give me the answer I had hoped for in Baghdad. He hasn't given it to me yet, but I hope all is not lost.
The Special Commission, who is supposed to be an impartial body, an impartial organ of the United Nations, is dominated by the Americans, who are implementing the policy of their government. This is unacceptable.
While in Baghdad, men have been signing up to rejoin their units to confront what they call imperialist and tyrannical American aggression. David Loyne, BBC News.
Well, earlier I spoke to our United Nations correspondent in New York, Rob Watson, and asked him what further options remain for the UN Security Council.
I think it's pretty clear that what the United States and Britain are pressing for is a resolution in the Council that will impose the travel ban that was threatened some weeks ago on officials associated with Iraq's weapons programs, and to try and get the other 13 members of the Council to commit themselves to further action should Iraq not back down.
But the travel ban in itself is hardly any form of punishment whatsoever for Iraq, is it?
You're absolutely right in the sense that it is entirely symbolic, because the officials concerned hardly ever leave the country in any case. But I think the point is the way that will be seen by Iraq. Now, from Iraq's point of view, they feel at the moment as though they're the aggrieved party, that there's no chance of the sanctions ever being lifted. They're cross with the way the weapons inspections are carried out. So from Baghdad's point of view, this will be the last thing that they want to see.
This is the same travel ban that France, China, Russia, 5 nations voted against last time. Will they vote in favour this time?
Well, according to US and British diplomats, they probably will, but I think they'll do so reluctantly because their underlying position remains the same. They want to see the sanctions lifted sooner rather than later, and a softer line towards Iraq.
Finally, and very quickly, Rob, will Iraq respond to this? They've been playing hardball so far. This extra piece of sanctions is hardly going to really change their mind, is it?
Apart from President Saddam Hussein, I don't think anyone really knows. If his long-term goal is to kick the UN out of Iraq for good, then I don't think it'll make any difference at all.
A Pakistani man accused of shooting 2 CIA employees in 1993 has been convicted of murder. 3 other people were wounded outside CIA headquarters during the shooting incident. Mir Aimal Kansi was arrested by FBI agents in Pakistan last June. He pleaded not guilty but put up no defense in court. The jury in Fairfax, Virginia, having found him guilty on all 10 charges, must now decide whether he should face the death penalty. President Boris Yeltsin of Russia concludes his visit to China with a visit to the northeastern city of Harbin, which was formerly controlled by Russia. In what's being described as a journey of reconciliation, Mr. Yeltsin will meet leaders of Russian and Chinese regions on either side of the border. On Monday, Mr. Yeltsin and his Chinese counterpart, Jiang Zemin, signed a pact defining their common border.
Boris Yeltsin came to Beijing to set the seal on 5 years of rapidly improving ties with China. The Chinese government showed its respect with a formal welcoming ceremony outside the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square. But the real business of the meeting came later, with the signing of a final accord on the demarcation of the 2 countries' 4,300-kilometre land border. The 2 leaders were clearly happy that years of painstaking negotiation had resolved a centuries-old source of tension. President Jiang Zemin said it was a significant step forward.
Now our 2 countries have solved their problems over the eastern border by a written agreement. This has created a solution that will mean a stable, peaceful and prosperous environment.
And Boris Yeltsin was in lyrical mood as he looked forward to a new era of relations between 2 former communist rivals.
I am sure in time, friendship and cooperation between our 2 people will transcend and strengthen. Chinese people and Russian people are like a bunch of flowers. On one side, 1.2 billion Chinese, on the other, 100 million Russians.
The personal warmth between 2 men who have now met 5 times in as many years was a feature of the meeting. Later, President Yeltsin went on to meet with China's Prime Minister Li Peng to discuss ways of bringing a similar warming in the 2 countries' trading relationship. And there was a further reminder of the symbolic significance of his visit, as in a gesture of reconciliation, the Russian leader laid a wreath at the monument to the heroes of China's communist revolution. Duncan Hewitt, BBC News, Beijing.
Indonesia's finance minister has defended the closure of 16 banks, despite being sued by 2 institutions which have ties to the family of the President Suharto. The banks were ordered to close last week after the International Monetary Fund announced a multi-billion-dollar aid package to steady Indonesia's faltering economy. Jonathan Head reports from Jakarta on the relations who are making life difficult for President Suharto.
Bambang Trihatmojo, President Suharto's second son, has created a political storm by accusing the finance minister of targeting his bank to discredit his father. He says he's now handed the case over to the courts. Bambang argues that his bank could and should have been saved. But given the powerful influence of the Suharto children, his outburst looks like an attempt to pull rank over the government. The president has now had to deploy his spokesman, Mudiono, to defuse the row. The official line from the palace is that the liquidations were carefully thought through and would not be reconsidered. By giving the green light for his son's bank to be closed down, President Suharto has, for the first time, allowed government policy to hurt the business interests of his family. But it took a severe economic crisis to get him to do it. There's no sign yet that the extraordinary privileges of the Suharto children are about to end. The most notorious of those privileges have gone to the youngest and favourite son, Tommy, for his Timor car project. Tommy was given massive tax breaks to make the so-called national car, even though it's imported from Korea. The car isn't selling well, and it's been challenged by Indonesia's main trading partners. And yet President Suharto says the project will continue, a sign that international pressure alone won't push him to move against his family.
After the business grow bigger and bigger, and they are really competing against each other, it is really hard to control the game.
Family life has always been a central concern for President Suharto. Critics argue that it's his major weakness. Now the aging Indonesian leader is finding that the demands of his children are increasingly in conflict with the more modern needs of his country's economy. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Jakarta.
The United States Special Envoy in Cyprus, Richard Holbrooke, has begun talks on the island with the leaders of the two communities there. He held separate meetings on Monday night with President Glafkos Clerides and the leader of the breakaway Turkish Cypriot state in the north, Rauf Denktash. The US envoy said he did not expect any breakthrough, but he added the fact that the talks are taking place shows that President Clerides and Mr. Denktash are willing to talk about issues of immense complexity that have defied solution for decades. 14,000 people have taken part in a demonstration in Paris to show solidarity with the people of Algeria. The rally was the culmination of a nationwide day of events organised by artists, intellectuals and human rights groups to highlight the plight of the Algerian people. The organisers called for an international commission of inquiry into the recent wave of massacres in Algeria. At least 60,000 people are believed to have been killed during the civil conflict there over the past 5 years.
It was supposed to be a silent march, but many of those demonstrating chanted slogans calling for peace in Algeria and an end to the massacres. Police put the number of those taking part in the protest at 14,000, and a long cortege made its way from a mainline rail terminus to a park on the edge of the city, where a rally was held combining readings, testimony and music from French and Algerian intellectuals and artists. Protesters were asked to send in postcards calling for the creation of an international committee of inquiry into the killings in Algeria. The aim was also to put pressure on the French government to take a stronger line with the Algerian authorities, though the Algerians have attacked any attempt to intervene in what they say is a purely internal affair. The demonstrators also wanted it made easier for Algerians fleeing their country to find refuge in France. Stephen Jessel, BBC News, Paris.
The Chinese government is taking steps to tackle a growing problem linked to China's economic boom. Millions of migrant workers are flocking to the cities, attracted by the lure of big salaries and new opportunities. But the government fears the presence of such large numbers of migrants could trigger social unrest.
Every day, migrant workers arrive at Beijing's railway station from the countryside, dreaming of making their fortune in the big city. Experts estimate that around 100 million people are currently on the move in search of new work opportunities. Afraid that the situation could run out of control, the Beijing authorities have deployed about 60,000 canvassers to find out exactly how many migrants there are, where they come from, what they do and where they're living. The authorities hope this exhaustive study will help them to come up with ways of dealing with the migrants.
We need to ensure that the majority of migrants observe the law and that they have proper living conditions, social security and decent incomes. Many skilled immigrants are trained here and then return to play an important role in their hometowns.
Not every move to the city is a success. Many spend their last savings on travel to the city, but once they've arrived, they don't always find work or a place to stay. A few are lucky.
There's
still a big gap in income between the cities and the countryside. I came to Beijing because it's a very civilized city with a rich cultural life. I hope to settle here, to build up experience and improve my life.
As a direct result of China's thriving economy, the construction industry in the cities is booming, and this is where many of the migrants find work. But they're regarded mainly as cheap labor and often accept conditions which be rejected by the locals.
Our farmland isn't enough to feed the family, so we come out here in search of work.
But the majority of the migrants end up living on the streets, looked down on by Beijing residents. As long as the countryside lags behind the cities, China's rural workers will continue to flock to the capital. Some may find prosperity, but for most the journey looks unlikely to result in a living standard any better than the one they left behind. Rita Payne, BBC News.
There'll be more world news in about 45 minutes, but now Maxine, back to you.
Tamor, thank you. And now for a look at the weather, here's Richard Edgar.
Let's take a look at the radar, because that's really told the story through the last 24 hours. And indeed, it's probably going to tell the story through the next 24 hours. If we roll the sequence, we can see the clouds coming in. In fact, we're going to end up with showers, I think, affecting many southern parts through the rest of this night, and then up into the northwest, perhaps showers or some persistent periods of rain for a time. But in between, you can see the skies have become clearer, and that means it's going to become fairly chilly as well. I think temperatures in places by the end of the night probably dipping down to these sort of figures, so by dawn through this coming morning we're going to find it cold enough in places for a little bit of ground frost in some areas. You can see temperatures just a degree or so above and below freezing. Now, as we go through into Sunday, into Monday I should say, into Tuesday, we're going to find this swirl of clouds stays with us. That's how it's been through the last 24 hours. The low pressure system continues to feed the unsettled weather in across not just the British Isles, but indeed across much of Iberia, through into France and into Scandinavia as well. Now that means it's going to bring showers. As we see these little features, trough lines coming through, we're going to see some more persistent periods of rain, and that little area of low pressure there means that the southernmost counties of the United Kingdom will probably mean the showers will turn to become more persistent rain for a time throughout Tuesday. I think as we move away from the Channel areas, though, it's not going to be too bad at all. A fine morning, a pretty chilly morning across the Midlands, up into northeastern parts of England, up into northeastern Scotland. Once any early mist clears away, then the day basically dry, sunny spells. The showers, though, packing into northwestern Scotland, into some of these western fringes of Wales, and through into Northern Ireland as well. Temperatures through Tuesday, best sort of figures around about 10 to 11 degrees. Let's move ahead through into Wednesday, because the low pressure's still there. That means more showers, particularly for the western side of the United Kingdom. A bit of frost to start the day, but early spells once we lose the mist and any foggy conditions. And as we go through into Thursday, the high pressure builds in. What does that mean? It means the nights are going to be rather more frosty, and the mornings could be a little bit more misty to start as well. But I think for most of us, by the time we get through into Thursday, it's going to be essentially a dry day. That is apart from one or two showers up there in the far northwestern parts of Scotland. Through the week, the best sort of temperatures generally range of 9 to 11.
In the local paper, and coming so soon after